quantum mechanics. How might you explain quantum mechanics? I'm tempted to give you a few minutes to explain it to each other, and some of you could. But it is a challenge. So let's consider some of our engagement and understanding of quantum mechanics. It is ineffable. That is, it's hard to explain in language. Our words suddenly seem too limited for the vastness of the idea of it. It is noetic. That is, it is theoretical and intangible, so we can only perceive it with our minds, with our intellect. We perceive that it points potentially to a very deep and sustaining truth. And it is passive in the sense that we cannot manipulate it. We understand that we are moved by forces larger than ourselves, vaster than our comprehension. In the elegance of its laws, we understand ourselves as being part of a vast union of all things in the cosmos. Now, admittedly, that is a poetic and ministerial engagement with quantum mechanics. But it is also, it strikes me, the same definition of mystical experience put forth by William James in his book, Varieties of Religious Experience. Quantum mechanics defined as mystical experience. Science and mysticism. As Unitarian Universalists, we tend to put our faith only in the rational, the analytical, the scientific. Our Unitarian Universalist theological history is one of dualism, one of dividing the body and mind, pitting at odds reason and faith, rationality and spirituality, mind over matter. Our 6 sources, they're printed on the back of your order of service, our 6 sources from which we draw inspiration includes humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. Evolutionary biologist Edward O. Wilson claims you cannot tread the path of spirituality and the path of reason. You must choose between them. And Unitarian Universalists have often, but not always, agreed. Put another way, Ken Welber asks, is the East's version of enlightenment compatible with that of the West? But are science and mysticism really mutually exclusive? And is it even in our best interests to believe that they are incompatible? Must we define science and all things spiritual as opposites? My purpose today, in fitting with the theme, is not designed to prove anything. Rather, I'd like to invite you into considering the implications of our habit of dualistic thinking, that either or instead of both and, by exploring a number of knowledgeable thinkers on the topic. I want to challenge you to examine your own assumptions, whatever they may be, on the topic this morning. First up is Jeffrey Kripal, a professor of comparative religion at Rice University. Kripal explains that his field is to explore words that have been heavily abused, like mysticism. He challenges the notion that we divide experience into mental versus material, mind versus matter, subject versus object. This either-or thinking, he posits, denies a whole category of human experience that resonates or corresponds across those perceived boundaries of definition. Anecdotes that defy the stark dualism of categorization. Experiences we commonly speak of in religious terms. Miracles, magic, and the paranormal. A mystical experience, says Kripal, is simultaneously internal and external. It is mediated by imagination like a waking dream. It does not fit neatly into one of the categories of the mere five senses that we recognize as tangible and thereby provable and therefore are considered scientific. A mystical experience, however, is marked by paradox, by coincidence. It is a both-and experience. Have you ever had an experience like that? Dreaming something before it happens. A sighting of something impossible, something you cannot explain. Have you ever had what you would consider a vision or a call? An experience of what the mystics call oceanic well-being, a sense of oneness with the universe. Have you ever known something deeply without having actually encountered it? A sudden insight. Have you ever experienced something with the coincidence of consequence? Something you would never believe if someone else had told you. Something you would not believe unless it had already happened to you. Think for just a moment of those experiences. Rest with its feeling, or the ones you've heard about. Jeffrey Kripal invites us all to become authors of the impossible by simply consenting to the possibility of experiences beyond the categories of what we believe to be only five senses. What are the implications for us if we trusted that there were even a sixth or a seventh or an eighth sense that was also truth? According to existential humanist psychologist, that's a mouthful, existential humanist psychologist Rollo May, in his book, The Courage to Create, what has driven the exorcism of mysticism in Western culture, why non-scientific, non-repeatable phenomenon, though common, is dismissed, is our increasing dependence on technology. May writes, irrational, unconscious phenomena are always a threat to mechanization. Poets may be delightful creatures in the meadow or the garret, but they are menaces on the assembly line. Mechanization requires uniformity, predictability, and orderliness. And the very fact that unconscious phenomena are original and irrational is already an inevitable threat. This is one reason people in our modern Western civilization have been afraid of unconscious and irrational experience. The danger, says May, always exists that our technology will serve as a buffer between us and nature, a block between us and the deeper dimensions of our own experience. Tools and techniques ought to be an extension of consciousness, but they can just as easily be a protection from consciousness. May was writing this in 1974, before home computers and the internet. His words ring more true now than he could ever have suspected. It is ironic, noted May, that if we are not open to the unconscious, irrational, and transrational aspects of creativity, then our science and technology have actually helped to block us off from creativity of the spirit, and ultimately also our scientific creativity. May cites scientific history that in modern physics it is very clear that major scientific gains are generally made because a physicist lets his imagination go and discovers something simply for the joy of discovery. But this always runs the risk of radically upsetting our previously nicely worked out theories, as it did when Einstein introduced his theory of relativity and Heisenberg introduced his principle of indeterminacy. Unconscious, irrational urges are bound by their very nature to be a threat to our rationality. Those urges are essential, though, for scientific advancement. As mathematician and theologian Alfred North Whitehead pointed out, science begins in wonder and is advanced through the audacity of intuition. 100 years before Rollo May, German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote an early work called The Birth of Tragedy, where he explains that artistic creation depends on a tension between two opposing forces, using the Greek concepts of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Apollo is the Greek god of light and reason. He's characterized by measured restraint and detachment, which reinforces a strong sense of individuality and autonomy. Dionysus is the Greek god of wine and music, and Nietzsche identifies the Dionysian as a frenzy of self-forgetting, in which the self gives way to a primal unity where individuals are at one with others and with nature. Both the Apollonian, what we may think of as science, and the Dionysian, which we may think of as mysticism, are necessary in the creation of art and in the advancement of science. Without the Apollonian, the Dionysian lacks the form and structure to create something cohesive. It lacks the motivation to follow through. But without the Dionysian, the Apollonian lacks the necessary vitality and passion for innovation. For Nietzsche, the enemy of creativity then was not science, and the enemy of science was not irrationality or even chaos, but rather the enemy of both was Socratic rationalism, a kind of scientific fundamentalism that for Nietzsche blunted the senses by denying all intangibles. These reflections of Jeffrey Kripal, Rollo May, and Nietzsche on the dangers of the dichotomy of our thinking can be illustrated by the story of my contemporary colleague, William Schultz. Schultz is best known globally as the former executive director of Amnesty International. Schultz had a humanist epiphany as a young man that called him to become a minister, even though he was an ardent and outspoken atheist. Sound familiar? Atheist ministers were still relatively rare, even among Unitarian Universalists in the 1970s when Schultz was in seminary. He tells this story in his book about the birth of religious humanism, about attending my alma mater. Schultz writes, "A little philosophy, it has been said, is a dangerous thing. By the time I got to theological school, I was pretty well acquainted with the existential philosophers, and during my years at Meadville Lombard Theological School, the Unitarian Universalist Seminary at the University of Chicago, I enrolled in as many philosophy courses and as few theology and Bible courses as I possibly could. I took particular interest in the philosophy of religion, and at one time I could recite almost by heart the refutations of each of Aquinas' 5 proofs for the existence of God. My newfound erudition convinced me that there was not even one respectable intellectual argument for traditional Christian belief. Aha! I can still hear myself crying. But can God create a rock that is heavier than God can lift? Only a resort to unsubstantial faith could rescue a theist from annihilation at the hands of a philosopher. I loved the story of the conversation between a philosopher and a theologian, in which the theologian remarked that pursuing philosophy was as frustrating as a blind person looking in a dark room for a black cat that isn't there. And the philosopher retorted, yes, and if I were a theologian, I would find him. Such a retreat into irrationalism was not for the faint of heart. My classmates in theological school took to calling me Bill the Boy Humanist. In 1973, when I was 23, I was rewarded for my non-theistic sanctity by being invited to become the youngest original signer of the Second Humanist Manifesto. Schultz continues. But over the course of my 4 years at theological school, 2 other developments in my life worked their ways with me. One was that I entered psychotherapy, and the other was that my family started dying. The result of the psychotherapy was that I came to have a far deeper appreciation for the irrational in every form, and a far greater access to my own feelings, to my limits, and to my yearnings than I had had before. Much of the manifesto's humanism seemed hinged, even arrogant, and certainly too quickly dismissive of the vast realms of human experience that could not be reached by cognition alone. In a paradoxical kind of way, this type of rationalism seemed suitable only for the meek, that is, for those afraid to make the journey into the interior haunts of the unconscious, to confront guilt, passion, and pain. I knew from my experience with psychotherapy that the only way to get through emotional despair was to dive right into the midst of it, frightening as that may be. But humanism seemed to think, yes, that was the right word, that there might be a way around it. For me, writes Schultz, that confrontation with despair became most poignant in the quick succession of deaths of 3 of the 5 adults who had formed me as a human being, including my mother. An only child with but 2 remaining close blood relatives, I found the world a far more bleak and lonely place than the brave words of the Humanist Manifesto I had signed. It read, man will learn to face the crises of life in terms of his knowledge of their naturalness and probability. Reasonable and manly attitudes will be fostered by education and supported by custom. Schultz says, while I retained a great respect for early religious humanism after I had finished my dissertation on it and graduated from theological school, as indeed I do today, these experiences crystallized its limits for me. If nothing human was truly alien to the religious, for example, then what are we to make of all the human experiences whose meanings could not be completely captured in scientific terms? Dreams, for example, emotions, religious aspiration, evil, and wanton cruelty. And what are we to think of the animal world? Are even the greatest apes nothing more than automatons? Of course, all of this could be reduced to physiological phenomena, but anyone who tried to capture the holistic significance of love or loyalty, of guilt or grandeur, in terms of brain cell functioning alone, could be rightly accused of displaying a pitiful paucity of imagination. Schultz's Science's journey from scientific fundamentalism to religious humanism resonates with my own story of faith development, and it mirrors many that I've heard from Unitarian Universalists. That 50% of Unitarian Universalists in North America are atheists or agnostics and still come to church is often met with, well, disbelief, for lack of another word. We are asked, why do we bother with religion if we don't believe? Unitarian educator and theologian Sophia Lyon-Fahs, in her essay, Why Teach Religion in an Age of Science, explains that emotional needs and impulses create and sustain scientific explorations and moral concerns. Religious educators pay attention to such needs and impulses in order to help transform them into moral and religious values that create and sustain ethical behavior. The task of religious educators is to show children and adults how to kindle and sustain their own basic emotions for the sake of ethical action, for justice, for universal empathy toward others, for hope. While physical and social science perspectives and insights must inform theological thinking, the search for meaning is not a scientific task. It is a religious task. Religion then reminds us of the mystery of science and the stories and the hidden truth of mysticism. Unitarian theologian Henry Nelson Wyman said, "Our capacity for reason is essential for judging and testing new knowledge. But reason alone cannot create new ideas. Creativity and insight arising from outside ourselves work in conjunction with reason to generate new knowledge." Science journalist John Horgan, author of Rational Mysticism, asks, must we wait until science produces a mystical technology powerful enough to deliver enlightenment on demand before we begin to believe that there is more than meets the eyes and all those other senses? Perhaps what we today label as mysticism is just an example of what Unitarian theologian Tandeka calls interaffective attunement. That is a mutual exchange of feeling states, that invisible but real neurological impact that we have on one another's feelings as we communicate, mirror, and respond to one another. You know how you walk into a room full of people and you realize something just happened? Someone's angry, someone's sad, someone's happy, before anyone's even said anything to you. It's kind of like that spooky action at a distance at work in quantum mechanics. I feel keenly the same pull that my esteemed colleague Bill Schultz felt, that we negate part of our humanity when we ignore the part of human experience that our current language and science and consciousness is unable to explain. Our analysis of despair, of war, of atrocities like the Paris shootings do not explain, do not comfort, do not prevent with our theories. Our exclusion of part of the drama of human experience endangers creativity. It undermines our ideal of inclusivity. It threatens Unitarian Universalism itself with an irrelevance born of arrogance. We would do better to practice humility in the face of those things that lie beyond our comprehension, beyond our named five senses. To stay open and present to the world allows us to find a deeper meaning. It allows us to forge connection. The relationship between science and mysticism is not necessarily one of opposites, but they are perhaps complementary engagements at work in the world. What we call science and what we label mysticism may not be as clear as we think, are surely not as divided as we think. Both, after all, seek to unify, to integrate, and to explain our experience as citizens of this vast interconnected web of existence. Both seek toward transcending our limited current viewpoint. They aim at a glimpse of eternity. As William Murray, a Unitarian Universalist who bills himself a naturalist, religious humanist, my mentor at school, who made me promise I would not convert to theism, Bill, I have not done so yet. Bill Murray said, Jesus was right, that man does not live on bread alone. We are that animal that also depends on love and laughter, thinking and contemplating, meaning and purpose, all of which can properly be understood as spiritual. May it be so.